It is Tuesday, February the 2nd, Groundhog Day in America. And welcome back to GoodFellows, a Hoover Institution broadcast examining social, economic, political, and geopolitical concerns in this time of pandemic. I'm Bill Whalen. I'm a research fellow here at the Hoover Institution, as well as the Virginia Hobbs Carpenter Fellow in Journalism. I'll be your moderator today. Now, if this is your first time watching GoodFellows, what you're in store for the better part of the next hour or so is a lively conversation featuring three Hoover Institution senior fellows, or GoodFellows as we jokingly refer to them, offering their insights to what may lie ahead in these uncertain times. Let's meet the GoodFellows, beginning with John Cochrane. He's an economist in the Hoover Institution's Rosemary and Jack Anderson Senior Fellow. Hey, John.
Hey, Cher's singing, I Got You, Babe, and I got to look at you guys again. What's going wrong here? Happy Groundhog Day.
Good to be with you, my friend. Second good fellow joining us from his wilderness outpost is Niall Ferguson. Niall is of course, a renowned historian and author, and he is the Hoover Institution's Milbank Family Senior Fellow. Niall, have you stepped outside your cabin? If so, did you see your shadow?
No, I have not stepped outside my log cabin yet, but will do shortly after this is over. And I still haven't seen the movie Groundhog Day, which is kind of almost a blot on my conscience, but I'll get to that eventually too.
I'm trusting our third good fellow has seen Groundhog Day because he is a Pennsylvanian, and that would be Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. He is the Hoover Institution's Fouad and Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow, and he is the author of the New York Times bestseller Battlegrounds, A Fight to Defend the Free World. Hello, H.R.
Hey, Bill. And if I had to do Groundhog Day every day, all over again, every day, I would do it with you guys. You know, it's really...
Always the optimist. But gentlemen, we're going to talk about the state of cities today, and we've brought on an urban economist to offer his thoughts on this. So joining us right now, Edward Glaeser. Ed Glaeser is the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University. He regularly teaches microeconomics theory and occasionally urban and public economics. Ed Glaeser has published dozens of papers on cities' economic growth, law, and economics. In particular, his work is focused on the determinants of city growth and the role of cities as centers of idea transmission. Best of all, as John Cochrane will tell you, Ed Glaeser received his PhD from the University of Chicago. Ed's book, Triumph of the City, How Our Greatest Invention Makes Us Richer, Smarter, Greener, Healthier, and Happier, is available for your perusal at Amazon.com. Ed, welcome to GoodFellows.
Thank you so much for having me on, but we forgot the most important part of my history. I'm a former Arch W. Shaw National Fellow at the Hoover Institution, which I am enormously proud. So,
thank you for adding that. May I ask you before we get into the conversation, who made you wear the bow tie, Cochrane or Ferguson? Which one?
I have not taken off this bow tie since 1979.
Ed, let me begin the conversation with this question. I'm in Palo Alto, California. We're all spread around here. I think HR is in Palo Alto today. Neil is out somewhere in the wilderness. I think John has gone to greater heights, literally in California, up in the mountains. But I'm about 30 miles south of San Francisco. And to understand the history of San Francisco, Ed, is to also understand cycles. There was an exodus out of San Francisco beginning in 1853 after the gold rush, an exodus in 1906 after the earthquake, an exodus in the late 1940s as housing prices took off after the war, an exodus in the 60s due to counterculture, an exodus in the late 80s when people started moving down the peninsula towards Silicon Valley, an exodus during the dot-com bubble burst in the early 2000s. Now we see the story of San Francisco and the word exodus again. Here's the question, Ed. Is this just history repeating itself in cities like San Francisco, or is there something different going on here?
I think we are at an extraordinary injunction point for cities. We are at a point in which cities are more vulnerable than they have at any point in the 1970s. I do not think that in any sense the demand for face-to-face interaction is gone. I think the world is filled with billions of people who are desperate to enjoy the company of other people and desperate to work together in the sort of very fertile face-to-face areas. But that doesn't mean that any one city has a lock on anything. And San Francisco does not either, despite its extraordinary success over the last 50 years. So it is very much a point in which every city needs to be asking itself, are you doing all you can to hold on to your talent, to hold on to the future of your businesses, the future of your economy? But I don't think that the city itself is going to disappear anytime soon.
Okay, fair point. Gentlemen?
Ed, one of the many things I've learned from you over the years is there's a third function of cities. And the first is agglomeration and production that goes with amenities. So I think both are true, say in New York. People go there because they have to, because that's where they're very productive working with other people. Rich millionaires go there because they love the restaurants. Both of those seem in great danger right now, especially in San Francisco, maybe New York as well. The third function of cities is decay. They become a place of fixed capital stock that you can live in cheaply if you're on a government check, and that seems like some of the danger of where you go if you overregulate, if there's too many rent seekers at the trough and so forth. And maybe you'd like to tell us a little more about the cycle of decay, the dangers of becoming the next Detroit, the possibility for everyone to pick up and move to Austin.
Thanks, John. And that's exactly right. I mean, the cities have this fixed capital stock that means that they, last for a long time. And that's one of the reasons why that observation is really important, is that San Francisco, even in even if this is a huge shock, is unlikely to turn into empty office towers, right? Mm-hmm. Because what happens is prices drop a lot before you start having everything empty out. And so you don't have an immediate reduction. What you have is sort of year by year, decade by decade, you have this slow grind of a sort of a city slowly coming apart. In places that start closer to the point in which, landlords start saying, if rents drop 20%, we're really going to stop this. Cities in the central U.S., places where rents are more like $20 a square foot than $80 a square foot. Those places, really, you could see vacancies. The fear, I think, that John also raised is one in which decline compounds itself. So a city receives an adverse economic shock. The city responds by, raising taxes. It doesn't particularly try to hold on to its talent. More skilled businesses leave. The city cuts back on public services. Crime rates go up. More skilled citizens leave. That is very much sort of the story that we felt in the 60s and 70s in many cities. And, that's very much what we want to make sure does not happen in as many places as possible. But these sort of cycles happen over and over, as you said, Bill, to start this out. But successful cities manage to reinvent themselves, as indeed San Francisco has. And that requires that they sort of mediate the downside of the cycle and stop the sort of perpetual decline feeds on decline feel.
One of the questions we're grappling with regularly on GoodFellows is the impact of COVID-19. And a hypothesis that's got a lot of journalistic traction is that COVID-19 is a unique death blow to some cities, at least, because it's made possible a new pattern of work. And many of us are simply not going to go back to the old ways that required us to be cramped in apartments in New York City. So I think it's worth pondering a little bit whether there's something special about 2020 that is going to make it harder for San Francisco to pull itself out of what looks to me, as somebody who's observed the city now for nigh on 20 years, like a pretty steady decline. The pandemic's a big shock. And I'm interested in how far cities can recover from these very unusual shocks like pandemics. As a historian, I'm inclined to think that they generally do, and that plagues far worse than COVID-19 did not kill off the great cities of Europe. So if I was to take a kind of first cut at this question, it would be, no, you're probably exaggerating the impact of the pandemic. It's pretty hard to kill a city. I mean, think of Naples, a city regularly over the centuries disrupted by volcanic eruptions. But people still flock back there. And I'm struck by the speed with which, after a major disaster, cities refill, even if it's as bad as a volcanic eruption. What's your take on that, Ed?
I just want to add to the question. There's also the effects of the U.S. Air Force, which did in some cities in the middle of the last century, and people flocked back. But you mentioned this question of face-to-face interaction. So really, the issue is not going to be COVID. I think we all see cities can come back from that, as they have come back from plagues. The question is Zoom. To what extent does the future require that face-to-face interaction? And how much does it require? San Francisco was already the city of the startup, but not the city of production. Only stuff that absolutely needed that face-to-face floating workforce. The minute you're kind of a business and you're there for 20 years and you get the gold watch, boom, off we go over the Sierra to where the taxes are lower. So how much will have to be done in that now very expensive face-to-face agglomeration?
So there are two questions here, and I want to sort of respond to both of them. One of which is Zoom the shadow of Alvin Toffler, the rise of telecommuting? For my entire life, in some sense, as an academic, I've lived under the shadow of Toffler's prediction that the rise of electronic technology would move us all to these electronic cottages, and we would just Zoom it in. And for 40 years after he wrote The Third Wave, he's been completely wrong. Right. So let's be clear on this. I mean, he got the whole thing backwards, in part because he took a single comparative static, a single effect, which was this would increase our ability to dial it in, but didn't look at everything else that would change along with a more technology intensive, globalized world, the fact that we became much more collaborative, the fact that the world became more complicated, and in a more complicated world, it's easier for ideas to get lost in translation, which makes it more valuable to be face to face. The incredible rise in the returns to skill, which have happened partially as a result of new technologies, partially as a result of globalization. And we are a social species that gets smart around being around other smart people. I know this more than from any data. I know this from the experiences I had when I was 21, sitting around John Cochrane in the University of Chicago, right? So this is sort of a huge part of what makes us human, is our ability to learn from one another. And I think looking forward today in 2021, there's no question that many forms of work will change, but we still have this fundamental thing that, for highly creative, highly interactive tasks, proximity is very valuable. Even more so, it is very hard to sort of get younger workers, or for that matter, younger students, engaged with the enterprise and part of the team if you're not doing it face to face. I don't know how many of you have had this experience with sort of people who you've been advising for years. This works. Zoom is great. Like old friends, it's totally fine, right? But if you ask me to inspire a bunch of 19-year-olds to get excited about mathematical economics over Zoom, it's much, much harder. And we see this in the Burning Glass data, where if you split up occupations between those occupations that can be done remotely and those occupations that need to be done face-to-face, the face-to-face occupations plummeted post-COVID. Okay, both employment and job openings on Burning Glass, and then both of them came back. Okay, both came back by the fall. The remote jobs, employment was steady. Burning Glass postings collapsed, and they've stayed collapsed. So they aren't hiring new workers, right? So Microsoft comes up with these reports that says that its programmers are just as productive post-Zoom as they were pre-Zoom. But overall Burning Glass hires for programmers are down by something like a third, which is suggestive of the view that you can take the old workers, you can ride on the relationships that are already built, but you're not going to start something from scratch doing this. So again, I think that this suggests that face-to-face working isn't really all that gone, but are plenty of startups going to start thinking, well, I can deal with my venture capitalists from Boulder. I can deal with them from Vail. I can deal with them from Bozeman, Montana, and it's a quarter of the price. So maybe I just want to take the whole team and take them there. That seems to be the more realistic approach than that, the startups of the future are going to consist of 5 25-year-olds all living in their apartments and Zooming it in. That just doesn't seem remotely plausible to me for the sort of dynamic, information intensive economy of the future. And it's also many of these.
Sorry, I was going to bring HR in on this. And HR, I guess nobody runs boot camp on Zoom.
Well, or rugby teams, right? I mean, anything that requires teamwork, and I think building a team, as Ed says, is very difficult to do remotely because that has a psychological, it has an emotional dimension to it. It has, in the case of the Army, an ethical dimension, as you create expectations of one another. And it strikes me, Ed, you mentioned the Tofflers, they wrote The Third Wave, but they also wrote War and Anti-War, and they were dead wrong about future of war as well. and I think the reason that they were wrong is they emphasized in both books, they emphasized change over continuity. And as my fellow historian, Ferguson would agree, I think, is that we have to keep mindful of continuities in the human experience, or else we're bound to make wrong decisions, right? The first step in making a projection in the future, I think, is understanding how the past produced the present. And whereas Carl Becker said that anticipation of future and memory of past have to walk hand in hand in a happy way. So I wondered if you could summarize for us what you see as continuities in the city. I think you've mentioned some of these already, and certainly having your scholarship in terms of our needs to be together, to be in a community. And what are the changes? And I think we're talking about the technological changes as well. And Ed, in context of that, Have you been following the line, the Saudi Arabian project, or NEOM, that Mohammed bin Salman's vision of a future city that argues that a different kind of city is necessary because of changes in technology? But really, the overall question is, how do you see continuity and change in cities?
It's a great question, and I'm going to take it in a slightly. I'm going to take it to cycle back to Neil's comment on the sort of long arc of plagues in cities, because I think there really are differences, and we can have different interpretations about 430 BC or 541 CE, which are the sort of two classic plagues. So the first is Thucydides and the plague of Athens, possibly killing off about a quarter of the Athenian population. Certainly, casting doubt on Pericles' strategy of waiting within the walls of Athens and harassing the Peloponnesian coast by fleet. Whether or not we think this was absolutely crucial, or the Athenian fleet ultimately perished because of Alcibiades' hubris in attacking Sicily is unclear. But it certainly was deeply damaging to that city that had been, in some sense, the brightest city of the Mediterranean world during this period. 541. Right, this is plague of Constantinople, first appearance of Yersinia pestis on European shores. Right, whatever hope you had that Justinian and Belisarius were going to reimpose the Pax Romana on the Mediterranean world, that hope vanished when the Black Plague showed up. So I agree strongly with Neil that post 1350 cities have been unbelievably resilient, in part because the 7 centuries that followed, right, the Black Death's appearance on Constantinople, were in some sense the creation of a much more resilient European world. Part of that was, in fact, defensive military, right? Instead of a military that was geared towards offense, it was a military that was geared around walls that could be defended. And if you lost a 30-year population, you could still defend those walls. But partially it was also smaller polities that were less prone to sort of immediately collapse when there was the disorder of this. And of course, Neil is particularly right that in the 19th century, when plagues like cholera and yellow fever, which were far deadlier than COVID by any stretch of the imagination, Paris, London, New York, they brushed those things off, and they used them as opportunities to come together and actually rebuild their cities to make them stronger. One final point that I think comes out of this, and this comes out of the work of Matt Kahn and others on how natural disasters impact things. In some sense, all natural disasters are mediated by the strength of civil society when they're hit. Right. So earthquake hits Haiti, larger earthquake hits Chile. Chile, death toll is minor. Haiti, it's a humanitarian disaster. Right. In some sense, the weakness of Justinian and Rome tells you why that became such a disaster. If that's clear. And then you've got to ask yourself, where is America in 2021? Are we as resilient as New York was in 1849, or are we somewhere that's less resilient than that? Or New York in 2001 when we were hit by the Twin Towers?
But this is a great point, Ed, which is the point that ultimately a disaster is only as disastrous as the institutions, the politics make it. And that's what makes me concerned for San Francisco, and to an extent New York, because when one contemplates the way San Francisco has been run as a city in recent years, it's almost as if they have a death wish. I'm still reeling at the thought that the people running public schools in the city thought it was worthwhile to rename about 40 of them because they had highly offensive names like Abraham Lincoln attached to them. Crazy people run San Francisco. They appear wholly uninterested in providing the kind of public services like housing and education that would make people want to live in the city. 20 years ago, it was a pretty attractive city to my untrained eye. I hardly ever go there. When I moved from Harvard to Stanford, I assumed I'd go there often. A few visits quickly taught me that the place had become really quite odious. And I think that's a failure of public policy that would have killed San Francisco even if COVID-19 had never struck. So it's really about how people run cities, not about which disasters strike them, don't you think?
Well, I mean, yes, how people run the cities are important, but and the city, any city that can command the kind of real estate prices that San Francisco commands, can't be called a complete. It may be a complete public disaster, but it's not a failed city yet. Right, a city where condos go for multiple millions of dollars is a city that still is appealing to somebody, whether or not it's appealing to you or not. Now, in some sense, that very appeal is what enabled the government of San Francisco to act in a way that was not targeted towards the services that you value. And in some sense, that's what's happened in many of America's most successful coastal cities over the past 20 years. The New York of the 1970s was a city where, as you know, its giant garment industry had disappeared in a short number of years, hundreds of thousands of jobs disappearing because of globalization and the deindustrialization. A city that tried to run a local welfare state and then found when it taxed the rich and when it taxed businesses, they just picked up and left, right? It found itself, right, going to the federal government, having Ford famously, he didn't literally say Ford to city drop dead, but the Daily News got the spirit of it right. And the city really had to reinvent itself. It had to realize that it didn't have a blank check. And city after city in the US came to that realization in the 1970s. And we had really an arc from the sort of progressive dreamer of the 1960s to the city manager mayor. Be they, you know, a Mike Bloomberg or a Tom Menino, these were sort of pragmatic people who understood that there's no Democratic or Republican way to clean up the trash or deal with the snow. And so that was sort of the consensus as of 2001. And the past 20 years have been an enormously rich set of years for cities. And they've responded by saying, well, you know, we can do whatever we want. We don't need to worry about businesses or rich people. Where San Francisco will always be that way. And now I think the question is, how many election cycles does it take for San Francisco and to New York to realize that they need to come back to the center and focus on core city services?
Let me challenge. So I think it's harder than you think. So first of all, you might want to use past tense on all those prices because they are plummeting.
Right, we don't actually, right, fair enough.
A great underreported in the national news story is the explosion of violent crime right now. Nonviolent crime and violent crime. Carjackings in Chicago are up 150%. Murders are skyrocketing. And part of that is the police are kind of taking a little bit of vacation and prosecutors are just not prosecuting shoplifting. The result being that stores are closing right and left. You know, crime is one of those things where it really hits you. Rich people can buy themselves public schools, but you can't buy your way out of crime. Then part of the loop is, yes, there's agglomeration. It's wonderful to be productive here, but there's also the great amenities. Well, of course, the businesses are all, that kind of shoplifting crime, the businesses all go, the people all go. And San Francisco compounds it with a wave of homeless. San Francisco spends $330,000 per homeless person on homeless services to not much effect other than to increase the number of mostly mentally ill and drug addicted people wandering around the streets. Somehow it doesn't have the money for public toilets even. That once you get over the crime, into the crime part. I mean, I lived on the south side of Chicago in the 1970s. It took a long time to convince people to come back. That seems like kind of a death knell for the cities that have let that happen, in part because now you mentioned sort of politicians with a general, let's get the city going, but politicians have a voter base, and once the rich people and the business people move out, their voter base is the people who are there now, who are not particularly interested. They don't like crime. And they don't necessarily like progressive nostrums, but they don't like gentrification. They don't like rich people moving back in. And this has been quite clear in Chicago, where local aldermen say, no, I don't want business and rich people moving in because my voters are the voters who are the ones who are there now, and they won't be there anymore. So who represents the potential that ought to be there that could move in?
Is there an answer to this question in migration? Because it seems to me what makes the United States a dynamic and successful country is partly the size and decentralization of the system. And one thing that I remember striking me when I was writing a book about American decline called Colossus was the decline of mobility between cities and between states. And my hope at the moment is that the shock of the pandemic is going to increase mobility back to its kind of normal level. And once you get that kind of mobility, the competition forces the bad cities to reform themselves or be Detroit. Could we see an increase or a return to normal of cross state line migration, city to city migration? I think we're seeing it already, actually. I mean, the standard move at the moment is San Francisco to Austin, Texas, and the other one is New York to name a city in Florida. So, I mean, my guess is that the best discipline for the bad cities is people moving to the good ones. And in the United States, that's really easy to do.
So Neil is taking my side on this. So there's a clear view between John and myself, and that I am somewhat more optimistic that cities will react soon enough, or at least a good number of cities will react soon enough to the threat of outmigration that they won't collapse entirely. But let me directly, and it's exactly through the process Neil was talking about, right? That we have this possibility of moving. Zoom has made businesses and people more mobile. Austin is more appealing than it's ever been. San Francisco needs to pay attention to it, or it will lose. So let me address two issues that John has raised, both of which are quite serious. One of which is crime moves quickly, and that is right. And we're not at a place that we were in 1985 or 1989, in which we think that safe streets are an absolutely sine qua non of every city. Right? This is not something where current political discourse has gone, and that's a problem. Because in fact, there's no way for the city to come back if it doesn't enable its amenities, its restaurants, its parks to be used. And that actually requires whatever one thinks about, stop and frisk or the other issues around race and policing, which I think of as actually quite serious issues. They need to be handled at the same time you keep safety. Right. And that actually requires not defunding the police. Almost assuredly, if you're going to ask more of your police in terms of respect and also ask them to prevent crime, you're going to actually have to spend more on them, not less. So that's sort of one thing that I think is absolutely critical on this. And how quickly this will happen. I will tell you that I have emerged out of the 90s and 2000s fairly optimistic relative to where we were in the 1980s about how quickly the police can actually stop crime. We've learned a lot about how effective policing can be, and things feel less dire in terms of the sort of complete helplessness that we felt in 1985 about like this can never end. The second point, which I think is I'll just tell a story about this. So John raised the sort of political economy issue of what happens if basically a mayor is elected by a constituency that doesn't care about businesses, that doesn't care about rich people, that thinks gentrification is nothing but evil and thinks it's great. Now, the story that I call this the Curley effect, named after the Boston mayor, James Michael Curley, who famously in 1916, when a British recruiting colonel, I think, came and asked if it was okay that he recruit Bostonians of British descent to fight in the Great War, he came to Mayor Curley and asked him. Now, Mayor Curley was an Irish American mayor who was deeply fond of twisting the lion's tail. And he responded to him, "Go ahead, take every damn one of them," was his actual line. And by this, of course, he meant that, not a single one of them were going to vote for him. His poor Irish constituents, his probability of being elected was increased. And that is a worrisome possibility, as John raised. That is a world in which the center doesn't rule, in which there's not sort of some sense the city actually needs its economic base. And I don't see that yet for, I believe that sort of we will get back to that in New York and San Francisco, and that the competition will win out. But, that is a very unfortunate outcome if it does occur.
Hey, Ed, we've talked about education and public safety, and I'd like to just add, how about equality of opportunity, which I think are related to both of those. What do you think have been the worst policies that have discouraged really growth in cities and exacerbated problems associated with poor education, lack of public safety and increased crime, and inequality of opportunity? And what are some of the best policy solutions that you've seen that have invigorated cities and addressed those interconnected issues and challenges?
It's a great question. And one of the things that the data that Raj Chetty and Nathan Hendren and John Friedman have made clear is that while cities are great places for productivity, they're not great places for opportunity of the poor. So if you come to a city as an adult, typically you do experience faster wage growth. You do, experience significant income increases. But cities, particularly dense urban cores, look quite bad for kids born in the bottom quartile of the population, of the income of their parents. This is for a cohort born around 78 to 83. So that's their cohort. So it's a particular cohort, but it's really shocking. Now, in terms of what public policies make that happen, or even why that is, it's hard to know. I mean, one part of it is probably the very isolation of the lives of the urban poor for the kids. So if you are an urban, if you're a poor adult, you're going to a job that's probably filled with a lot of people who are, richer than you, who are better educated than you. You're part of an integrated world. If you're a poor kid, you often will live in a housing project, a public housing project perhaps, that is, highly segregated, and then go to a school that is deeply isolated and underperforming. The urban schools are, of course, a huge issue. You see a huge break, unsurprisingly, in terms of upward mobility right at the boundary of the urban school district. It is amazing, and in fact, I often contrast these stories that the crime really, police departments changed rapidly, and crime really fell quickly in cities. The project of urban school reform has been unbelievably painful and slow. And, like many people who are going to be listening to this call, I have a deep fondness for some form of competition in this market. I think right now, given the difficulties of doing anything within the public schools, I like the idea of sort of wraparound vocational training that could be completely competitively sourced and done outside of the unions. But schools are very, very hard. The other low-hanging fruit that really should be a priority post-COVID is rethinking the business permitting of new firms, both in cities and in states, with things like occupational licensing. It is an outrage in this country that we regulate the entrepreneurship of the poor so much more strictly than we regulate the entrepreneurship of the rich. If you want to start your internet phenomenon in your Harvard College dorm, right, you will have to have 1 billion users before any regulators notice you. If you want to start your small grocery store that sells milk products 5 blocks away, you have 15 permits to go through to get it, right? That is outrageous, and that is something that we are desperately. 100,000 restaurants have closed, or eating and drinking places have closed this year because of COVID. We're going to need to start new restaurants, and this is exactly the time to think about things like one-stop permitting and taking a cost-benefit analysis hatchet to the regulations that exist on the books.
This is music to all our ears. Ed, thank you. So nice to hear that message coming from Harvard. But here's a new direction I want to take this conversation in. I can see two futures for cities. One is the kind of cyberpunk city that you could read about in science fiction in the 1980s and 1990s, the kind of snow crash San Francisco or LA, which is public squalor, private affluence, a kind of wasteland, anarchic wasteland, techno enabled, but basically without law and order. The other city of the future is, I'll just call it the Chinese panopticon. The much larger cities of East Asia, and let's remember that the Asian cities are much larger than our Western cities, are gradually going to conform to the smart city model, which is being pioneered in some Chinese cities, a surveillance city in which there is absolutely no disorder because every citizen is under constant surveillance, and a social credit system can even prevent you using public transport if you're a naughty person. I think we should talk a little bit about these cities of the future, because it seems to me that the more cyberpunk Western cities become, the more attractive the Asian panopticon becomes. And it's interesting that the Chinese are already able to export their facial recognition technology and all the associated artificial intelligence to a very large number of countries around the world. So which of these cities do you think will predominate 20 or 30 years from now? Will we be living in cyberpunk Blade Runner type cities, or will we find ourselves, in fact, in the panopticon?
I cannot tell you how much I hope, Neil, we get neither of those two delightful options that have been offered from us. And let me take my way of responding to this, which is, I think there's no question that 2021, many of us think that we need to have a more effective executive branch within governments, state, local, federal, right? That our government failed on responding to COVID in many ways, at many levels. Our vaccine rollout right now is currently not feeling like a model of competence. We probably even need some cross-national strength that looks more like a NATO for health than it does the current WHO, so something that is more muscular and empowered that way. John's comment about crime at the local level, crime doesn't go away by singing nice songs. Crime requires a strong, functioning city government to actually handle that, which is your panopticon. That's your strong government. The problem, of course, is that that can be terrifyingly abused. I mean, there's a line that I'm fond of using with my undergraduates, which is my father grew up in Hitler's Germany and my grandfather grew up in the Tsar's Russia, and I have my doubts about the benevolence of government. That means that somehow or other, and this is why the sort of wisdom of Hoover is so vital. We need to understand how to expand our state without turning ourselves into a police state. We need to have a world in which we manage to do a better job on closing international borders when a new pandemic comes up, without immediately, turning ourselves into a state that's too controlled at the center. And that is a very difficult. It's a very difficult path to find, but it's fundamentally the path that the Federalist Papers tried to achieve. I mean, that was Alexander Hamilton's goal, was to try and create a state that was powerful enough to protect its citizens and to enable trade and to enable people to have the freedom to find their own futures, and at the same time to restrict itself. So I don't know exactly how to get there, but I know that we need a stronger state than we currently have to avoid the cyberpunk vision, but I know we need to have far more controls on the state than in your panopticon vision.
I want to challenge a little bit your view of cities, offer a third version to Neil's version, and then maybe HR, who's been in cities like Baghdad, can tell us a little bit about different kinds of cities too. The vision you offered was that cities are back because of the great agglomerations of tech and so forth, which I think is a little bit narrow from our experience of living in Manhattan or in San Francisco. 99% of the people in the world do live in cities, but they live in cities where what they do is not sit around and discuss the latest way to run AI software to start a new company. They do very traditional things. And it's interesting, they do them in cities. We mentioned historically. So in the recent past, we had cities because you needed walls. And everybody, the cuteness of Europe is because walls were expensive. We had to live close to each other. Then I think in the 1900s, we lived in cities because the provision of public goods was geographically concentrated, things like water and so forth. And also you needed person-to-person exchange. But what we saw in the US from the 1950s to the 1970s was, in fact, sort of the end of cities. There was a natural force towards suburbanization. We had transportation. We had a certain amount of commuting. You go to places like China, where there's, lots of cities, but it's not about the great agglomerations of intellectual exchange. It's about a factory, and it's really cheap to put up apartments. So that's a different kind of city. I don't think, the US is at a different level. You go to Baghdad, that's still a city, although we're not really thinking about that's not about developing new software. But in the American context, is it not possible that the early 2000s were a little bit of a blip where the young tech people and finance people went back to cities, half for agglomeration, half for the amenities that they temporarily had, but that the natural forces are towards suburbanization, and those forces would continue?
So there's a question as to what do you actually call suburbs? So, for economists, right, we define cities as the absence of physical space between people, the absence of physical space between economic actors. And so a place like Palo Alto is not necessarily a classic city, but there's an awful lot of density of talent that's close to one another in those areas. And it's enabled by cars rather than by walking. So I think it is clear over the past 20, 30 years that the sort of lower density parts of the US have hollowed out relative to the higher density parts of the US, particularly actually the second decile in density, which includes places that would look more suburban to you than places that look more urban. It's harder in the US context to be entirely confident about where we're going relative to car-based versus downtown stuff. But even in the past 20 years, even in this great golden time for New York and San Francisco, the population growth was much heavier in the car-oriented suburbs than it was in the urban cores. So even during that time period, you have a reasonable case for that. nonetheless, I think there's a fair argument that our great urban agglomerations were still the economic heart of our world, even if they were people driving to get to the offices to connect with one another. And that's even more so in the developing world. One thing where I do want to push back on the sort of China view is, you've been to Shenzhen, you've been to Shanghai, right? These are places with a lot of knowledge that's moving quickly over places. So I don't think that our view of sort of China as a smokestack, 19th century area, albeit there are lots of Chinese cities that are built on, overly ambitious local government leaders pumping up the construction machine. But there are, in the most successful Chinese cities, these are places that are as information and knowledge intensive as anything we have anywhere else in the world.
Let's bring in HR. But first, Neil, do you want to fact check your colleague?
I need to, because I think I heard you say, John, that 99% of people lived in cities, and you must have known as you were saying it that was nonsense.
No,
we only recently crossed globally the 50% mark.
2007, right? 2007
the latest
was that
percentage is 56% of the world's population is urban. But half of them are living in towns with less than 500,000 inhabitants, which barely qualifies as a city. So I just wanted to point out, because as the representative on the show of rural life, because I actually hate cities and I like living far from the madding crowd, where true, clear thought can be pursued without the distractions of internet cafes and all the other rubbish. A lot of people still live in the country, and I want to break a lance for the idiocy of rural life, because it's not actually that idiotic, and to make the point that actually these arguments about collaboration, proximity, the need to be in a city, I think they're much less compelling thanks to the internet, not just Zoom, but all that is now possible. I've been almost a year now in the middle of bloody nowhere, and I don't think I've suffered any significant intellectual deterioration. Correct me if I'm wrong, dear colleagues, because you've had a weekly opportunity to check on it. But I just wonder if, and here I'm going to go out on a limb, if COVID-19 is just the wake-up call and the first of multiple pandemics, if we've actually reached a point of excessive proximity and density of population as a species, maybe this is just the beginning of the end for the urban age, and we'll look back and say 56% of the world in cities was too high. It was actually dangerous to have us all crowded together in these megalopolises where the probability of infection was actually high, where novel pathogens were highly likely to spread rapidly. You might have read Geoffrey West's amazing book, Scale. Geoffrey argues that the thing about cities is you get increasing returns to scale, both of good things and of bad things, creativity and drug abuse. So I wonder if there isn't an opportunity here to reclaim rural life, and that we may actually as a species have to do that
Neil,
for the sake of our own survival.
That would go against all of history, because as you know, the death rate in cities was much, much higher. Well, cities came back, as you said, after the plague, where 2/3 of the people died. I hope I got that number right.
But John, actually, this is my point. We never had in all of history this many people, and we certainly never had this larger proportion of the population.
I'm on John's side, but let me just make one thing. If sitting in 541, you would not actually say it went against all of history, right? If John could have made that comment in 541 and said, "Oh my goodness, Europe is never going to become rural again. This urban civilization that we've had for the last 9 centuries will continue," and yet, the plague that struck Justinian was followed by 8 centuries of a more rural Europe, and a Europe that really did go backwards.
Well, that was a collapse of civilization, though, which is something that could happen. And
that's right. I think that's close to Neil's vision. That's the Neil's vision is, and not just a bunch of things with like 1% mortality. We need a bunch of plagues to get to Neil's vision, which has not just the level of communicableness of a COVID-19, but also a level of mortality that's much higher, right? Because this is just to the extent the amazing work that Anoop Milani has been doing, serological work in Mumbai slums, right, gives us that more than 50% of Mumbai slum residents had been exposed to the disease by the end of July, right? And yet the mortality rates were tiny. Young population, low levels of obesity. This will do nothing to the urbanization of the poor world if this is what it looks like.
Let's get HR back in the conversation. Well, you should know the good general is a contradiction in terms. He's an optimist, and he's from Philadelphia.
Well, HR also is from Baghdad. No, I'm
Way
serious
back.
about this. I think we're taking a very US-centric view, which is fine. Our
Yeah.
audience is US. But most people in the world live in cities like Rio or Baghdad, where, the crime levels are outrageous compared to what we have now. And they're not brought there to write computer programs. That seems to be a model that in that part of the world is, at least, they're still living in cities. And you also know something about trying to get the peace in cities like that.
Well, this goes to Neil's point on how resilient our cities, and I think they're quite resilient. And I'll tell you why. But first of all, I'd like to say, Neil, it kind of hurts my feelings a little bit that we miss you a lot. Apparently, you don't miss us as much as we miss you. But but I do think there is that psychological, emotional, the social draw of cities. I think I've seen it. Right, I've seen Kabul with the life choked out of it by the Taliban. When we went in there in 2001, I saw it with the time. I got to see it in 2003 as it was coming back to life. A city that had been reduced in population to 500,000, right? It had like maybe 2 phones in the city. People were fearful, of stepping out of line in any way, lest they wind up in the soccer stadium for the mass execution. And so that city now is 3 million people. It's thriving. It's a bustling city. And so what changed? Hey, just security changed, right? Just getting rid of the Taliban, and people came back naturally in a very rapid way. Now, a lot of the land is still informal in the city. It grew in kind of a hodgepodge, disorganized, crazy way, but it came back. And then I saw the same dynamic in Baghdad as well. I was there, of course, during the really terrible period of the Civil War, when violence was at its highest and multiple mass murder attacks were occurring. And you see the effect as communities draw in on themselves. And you move through these empty streets and you think, well, the city must be empty, but it's really not empty. It's just everyone has gone inside of their homes and is in hiding, essentially. Any common areas, marketplaces are empty. No restaurants open. But when you reestablish security, it just comes back. We did this. We had a major operation in microcosm in a city called Talafar in Nineveh province. Again, the life had been choked out of the city by Al Qaeda in Iraq, and a sectarian civil war that was going on in microcosm within the cities. Again, the communities had fallen in on themselves. The hospital was not a place where they cared for people, but a place where Al Qaeda murdered people. And so all the schools were closed for over a year. And once we conducted a major offensive with courageous Iraqi comrades there, we were able to lift that pall of fear off the city. And what we had done is, before the operation, we planned for a restoration of basic services, all of which had been impossible because of the violence in the city. We had the transformers and the lines ready to go. There was a big hydroelectric dam close by there as well. But we also planned for the reopening of the schools, and contracted through the Iraqi government to refurbish the schools, and to have the teachers lined up and trained remotely in Mosul, and the educational materials and so forth. So we took a systems approach to all of this planning and had it all ready to go and resourced. So once Al Qaeda was defeated, the city just came back to life so quickly. Reconstruction of police stations and retraining of police, introducing them back in the communities. Now, of course, this is all reversible, right, as we saw with the rise of ISIS. But it was amazing to go back there, a year later, and just to walk around with no body armor, with my Iraqi friends. Of course, I would say at the top of the list was competent leadership, which we've talked about as well, and leadership that is trusted across the various communities in that city. The mayor, Najm Abed Abdullah Al-Jabouri, who is now the governor of Nineveh province, is a phenomenal human being, who brought these communities who had been shooting at each other together. Once the extremists were gone, he mediated between these communities, and they worked together, for their common future. Everybody has a certain basic humanity in common. So, I mean, that's my experience. Cities are extraordinarily resilient, and especially in places that have this, this geographic draw, like Baghdad at the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, for example. And what you need, and I saw its stark absence, right, is leadership, and security.
I couldn't agree with you more, General, that you need both the sort of the combination of strong, competent leadership that is trusted by a wide set of people. Neil's vision of perpetual pandemic is incredibly dark. It is, I guess, possible, but I want to highlight that isn't just catastrophic for America's cities. 1/5 of the American labor force, right, employed labor force prior to this worked in leisure, hospitality, and retail trade. Right, those were jobs that provided a safe haven when automation caused the factory jobs to go away. Those jobs disappear in a heartbeat when a face is a source of peril rather than a source of pleasure. And so I cannot imagine a world in which America provides employment for its less skilled workers that does not have the capacity of an urban service face-to-face economy. So I think for that reason, as for many others, we really need to invest enough to make sure that our cities become safe again. And I think that very much does require the sort of strong, capable leadership that takes care of the whole city that you were describing, General.
And there are two biological futures. I share some of Neil's worries that, evolution takes a look around us. Waterborne diseases aren't doing so well, but boy, respiratory ones there, we've given evolution a chance there. So we could be the era, every globalization era has had pandemics. And contrary to my own previous comments, we're much more risk averse than we used to be. We used to put up with, 1918 flu. Yeah, right. People are dying on the streets. Get back to work. Now, much lower death rates, and we shut down the whole economy. So we are, in some sense, more susceptible to it. The other way is, we've seen the scientific miracle. mRNA vaccines may be so damn good. And we, if in a weekend we can stop any bug, and next time around not have the FDA and the CDC in the way, we might have actually conquered those and be towards a much more bug-free future. So I'd say both possibilities are there, and it'll be interesting to see what the biology does to us.
My money's on the antibiotic resistance bubonic and pneumonic plague to send us right back to the 1340s. And do not laugh, gentlemen, that is all too possible. I want to maybe offer a concluding thought. There's a paradox about our conversation. And the paradox is that I don't think any of us is speaking from a major city. And many of the world's most famous universities were located by design far from the cities. I think of my own beloved Oxford, of Cambridge, of the other Cambridge, Massachusetts, where you are, Ed, and Stanford is another of these universities carefully located in what was farmland. So how do we reconcile the paradox? We keep saying that cities are vital for all this intellectual creativity, but for some reason, most of the great universities, Chicago being a notable exception, aren't in big cities.
Let me challenge that. That was set up when population growth, the death rate in cities was so high that they only grew in population when more people moved in than died there. Cities were just horrible places to live. So they were set up as bucolic places where you could actually survive. And now universities located out in the country are doing terribly. Students want to go to Columbia, NYU, now Stanford counts as city, but the ones located out in beautiful countryside are just, they have no students. No one wants to go there anymore.
Well, there are exceptions to that, I would say. Mr. Jefferson's University in Charlottesville, for example. And I think we are talking a little bit, and Neil's alluding to this tension between sort of a Hamiltonian vision, of successful American cities, and a Jeffersonian, vision of the American agrarian ideal. But and I think you still see those tensions today.
Let me throw out Daniel Patrick Moynihan's famous quip that if you want to build a great city, build 2 world-class universities and wait 50 years. Most of the places that Neil has mentioned are places that have developed great urban agglomerations around them, even though they were originally bucolic, including, of course, Stanford, which was, a ranch and is now the center of one of the great sort of, maybe it's car-based, but one of the great urban agglomerations of the world.
So the obvious solution is build a new university in a state other than California and see what happens.
And make it a serious university that is devoted to the actual advancement of knowledge that's useful to people.
I'd like to wind down the conversation. I'd like to get everyone's thoughts on this. Ed, you go first. Triumph of the city. You suggest that cities are the avenue for making us richer, smarter, greener, healthier, and happier. I'll grant you the first three: richer, smarter, and greener. As we look to the future, since we like to look forward on GoodFellows all the time, tell us how cities are going to make us healthier and happier in the future, if, as Neil suggests, pandemics are more the norm.
There's no question that there are demons that come with density. The congestion of city streets, there's the facilitation of crime, there are high housing costs, but the most terrible of the demons of density is indeed contagious disease. And it is an old companion, documented at least since Thucydides wrote about the plague of Athens, but quite possibly plagues killed the Bronze Age civilizations of the Mediterranean as well. So anytime you have people who are connected both globally, right, through cities are the nodes for global transport, and locally, right, plague can cross people, and that is a real issue. Now, we had a blessed century from 1919 to 2019 when that didn't rage, but it is indeed a possibility. I am optimistic enough that I believe that we will actually face this existential threat to urban life and actually do the investments that we need to, with the help of, the amazing things that have happened in vaccines to make that possible. But I admit that I accept that Neil's darker prognosis is also a possibility. But you're not going to stop me from being optimistic both about life and about cities. Now, in happiness, I think the point here is that, for billions of people throughout the world, unlike Neil, social isolation has been some form of hell, right? That in fact, the world is filled, America is filled with millions of people, millions of teenagers who've been forced to grow up and accept the responsibilities and stress of being older without any of the freedom, without any of the social connection, the social ties. And I think that, cities have been enabling us to find pleasure and do miraculous things, working together for thousands of years, since Socrates and Plato bickered on an Athenian street corner, and the age of urban miracles is not over.
Well, I hope cities become a place that help, really pragmatism triumph over sort of the ideological, movements that we've seen, and the orthodoxy, associated with, the far right and the far left, and stressing, what's different about us. And I hope that cities, because they do bring people together, will foster common understanding across, different communities of Americans, and restore confidence in who we are as a people and in our democratic processes and institutions. I think we all ought to demand more from our leadership. And I think the greatest promise is at the local level, where people want better education for their children. They want better services so that they can live more comfortably, and they all ultimately want to build a better future, for their children and grandchildren. So cities should be a place where you can attain those goals, and I think we ought to demand that our leaders put policies in place that allow Americans to achieve those goals.
I'll add some lessons that I've learned from Ed Glaeser over the years, or at least I'll credit you with. Far from demons of density, density is wonderful for all sorts of things. There, of course, people seem to be, for 10,000 years, they've been more productive in cities. Ideas have come from cities. Civilization comes from civitas, live in cities. Cities there's increasing returns to scale. So the public goods, whether provided by government or by businesses, tend to be in cities. Cities are green, something we haven't talked about. The best thing for the planet is for people to live in apartment buildings and walk to work and leave the countryside alone. Cities, however, the locations of current cities, we talked a little bit about that. Locations of current cities make no sense. Locations of current cities are just happenstance. I learned from Ed, most of the East Coast cities are on the fall line, where it was easy to make a mill, or the highest point that you could bring a ship up a river. None of that matters anymore. In fact, I think if we were to resettle the US and it were to be settled invaded by Japanese and Chinese, the whole East Coast would be completely unsettled. We'd all be in the West Coast, and a lot of Maine would be completely just woods right now. San Francisco. Why is San Francisco where it is? Because it was a good sailing ship port in 1850. The port moved to Oakland, and there's no reason for San Francisco. Once the railroad came in and stopped in Oakland, there's no reason for San Francisco to be there. It's got a capital stock. And the point, it needs to reinvent itself. Every city that is successful now is not doing what it did 50 years ago, and it's not doing the reason for it being where it was. And reinventing yourself is hard. This is the place where all the standard market economics is a little bit of a problem, because the young people go there because the bars and restaurants go there, and the bars and restaurants are there because the young people are there, and the tech companies are there because the young people want to be there. And we kind of get everyone to move to the same place at the same time. And if it's too bad, we're all going to pick up and go to Austin. So the process of reinvention has to happen. Reinvention coordination has to happen. And so which cities, I think, remains the important question.
Okay, Neil, who apparently doesn't miss his colleagues as much as they miss him.
Well, I get to see them via Zoom. And as we began the conversation by observing, it's pretty much as good if you know someone well. I grew up in a very rough city, Glasgow, which went through some very tough times. When I was a kid, you've read Hillbilly Elegy, perhaps. Well, we did all that long before J.D. Vance was born. And there's one thing I learned, which we haven't talked about, and that is the problem that cities are very anti-conservative places. Cities are where socialism tends to breed. And we complacently look forward to a time when ever more of the population are in cities. Well, I tell you what that will mean politically, my friends. The decline of the countryside and of the small town and the rise of the metropolis means an inexorable move to the left politically. And that's something that I think my colleagues are giving too little attention to. Last thought, bring us back to the Chinese city. If there are recurrent pandemics, then there will be strong incentives, even in the West, to create systems of surveillance. We talk about contact tracing often on this show. For an authoritarian government, nothing could be better than a really efficient system of digital contact tracing, because then you'll be able to know not only where everybody is, but who they're with. So I think we have two real things to worry about as the world becomes ever more urban. One is that it goes ever further to the left, and the other is that it becomes ever more authoritarian. I'll stick to the countryside. Thanks very much.
Okay, Ed Glaeser, I have to give you the final word here, and the final word is a thought about Glasgow.
I'm going to so I was just saying, Glasgow, Neil, is the only place where I've ever seen a pub fight where someone literally took a chair and struck another person over the back with it. So I can confirm that Glasgow can be a rough place occasionally.
That's because the table was too heavy to lift, I presume.
Okay, gentlemen, we're going to leave it off at that. Thanks for a lively conversation. We could keep going on this. This is a great topic, and maybe we'll have you on a future show and pick up where we left off. We'd love to have you.
This is fabulous fun. Thank you so much for including me.
So that's it for this episode of GoodFellows. We'll be back next week with a new episode, a new conversation. On the behalf of Hoover's GoodFellows, Niall Ferguson, HR McMaster, John Cochrane, our guest today, Ed Glaeser. We wish you and yours the very best. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll do our best here at the Hoover Institution to help you stay informed. We'll see you next week.